Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining. It's truly a pleasure to have you on. I'd love to start off if you could do an introduction, maybe describing your educational background and where your career has taken you.
Sure. So I think when I left undergraduate, I wasn't exactly sure that I was actually going to do graduate school or do academia. In fact, I started interviewing for consulting jobs, but it happened to be a bit of a recession. The consulting firms weren't hiring, so I decided to go to grad school. And even in grad school, I sort of always had one foot a little bit in practice. I did a lot of consulting for companies and market research, and as I went along, I realized that I really enjoyed the research, and so decided to look for an academic job. So I have my background's maybe a little bit unusual for people that study entrepreneurship. My undergraduate's sort of a general social science and history, and then my PhD is actually in sociology. But then I've continued to sort of look at, kind of business from a lens that's maybe kind of someplace between sociology and economics.
Amazing. And I was just kind of wondering, as you touched on entrepreneurship, specific to your students or specific to you, what do you think makes a strong entrepreneur and some characteristics that might feed into that?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of, I actually, when I start my undergraduate or my, kind of graduate classes on entrepreneurship, I'll often start with what I call the myths of entrepreneurship. I think there's a lot of, widely held beliefs about what it takes to be a good entrepreneur that just aren't true. One is that dropouts are better entrepreneurs. In fact, we know that that's not true. The more education you get, the more successful you're likely to be as an entrepreneur. And that holds true even up to people getting PhDs. So, education is actually, one thing that can lead to more successful entrepreneurs. Age actually, interestingly, is another thing. I think people think that entrepreneurs have to be young. But if you look at the statistics, the average age of entrepreneurship is 42. And the average age of highly successful growth entrepreneurs is 45. One of the reasons why I think that's true is that, becoming a good entrepreneur often means knowing a lot about an industry, knowing a lot about a business, and that's something that you learn over time, as you work in the industry. The other thing, which I've actually done a lot of research on, which I think is important, is having good social networks. Right. And part of being an entrepreneur is getting people to lend you resources, whether that's money or whether that's getting people to help you out with their time. And a lot of that is about, making connections with people. You don't really have much to offer them other than, kind of trust and promises in the future. So people that, build large networks and are effective in their relationships with people also tend to be really effective entrepreneurs.
Amazing. Yeah, that's a really surprising statistics for that medium age range. Typically when I think of an entrepreneur, I think younger or like
Yeah.
the older you get, you think more of the risk, which is good to consider, but ultimately that doesn't seem like that's the case. As you're speaking on student success, students and education potentially being more successful, is there any students or student graduates in any of your career history that you think ultimately were successful and had a good story overall?
I mean, I've had a lot of students that have been successful over the years. One who came through UCLA recently, who I, really liked. I thought she is a great entrepreneur. Is Emily Smith. She developed a new idea for a protein powder based on peas. So it's a protein powder that's, okay for vegans. Also easier to digest because it has an enzyme incorporated in it. But what's made her a great entrepreneur is that, I think she's just been brilliant in the way that she's marketed the product. She's actually spent very little on marketing because she's made widespread use of, kind of micro influencers on primarily on Instagram as a way to, kind of drive traffic, get people to try out the product. And as a result, she's already in, I think something like 300 stores nationwide, even though she launched, I mean, now about 2 years ago. So, and there's a number of entrepreneurs that are like that at UCLA. It's, there's a real sort of tradition of entrepreneurship here.
Very cool. And speaking on that strategy, how you mentioned that she barely spends much on marketing and ultimately has become successful. Is there any chance you could like touch on strategy within the business realm and how to be strategic in business?
Yeah, I mean, strategy is obviously a big question. And I think I actually would even think about kind of distinguishing between strategy for the business and then thinking about things that are more kind of tactically smart. Strategy at the business, I think, particularly for an entrepreneur, is a lot of it is about having a theory of success. Like, what is it that you believe about the world, about what people want, that explains why people might buy your product or service. And then it's going out and trying to test to see whether or not those assumptions are true. Sometimes people call this the value proposition, and that, I think that's fine as a way to think about it. Why is it that people are going to value your product? But, having kind of a clear statement of why people would want the product and what the assumptions are behind that is incredibly valuable to to early success of a business. Tactically, I think one of the things that really great entrepreneurs do and is that they oftentimes try to think about, this is maybe a little bit more technical, but think about how to take things that in most businesses are fixed costs, right? Like you need to pay a huge amount of money up front and turn them into variable costs so that, you really only have to pay when you sell or when you're producing a product. Now, that typically means that they're less efficient, but it also means that you need less money up front. And so you can get started even though you may not have a lot of financial resources. An example of that kind of in practice, like if you're thinking about consumer packaged goods, it's worthwhile learning about co-packers. Co-packers are businesses that basically outsource getting all of the ingredients that you need, putting together, mixing them together, packaging them, delivering them to stores or delivering them to you so that you can do mail order. And they do that, kind of in different, some of them in relatively small batches. So instead of needing millions of dollars or even hundreds of $1,000s to set up a factory, you can get started with maybe, tens of thousands of dollars or less.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, like those assets and the liabilities, like that's so important and like balancing those because you can get so in over your head. Another question I have for you is UCLA, as it is an amazing university. I was wondering, maybe specific to entrepreneurship, how do you think that program differs from other universities?
Yeah. So UCLA actually is one of the oldest entrepreneurship programs among the top schools in the US. So the Price Center, which runs the entrepreneurship programs, both at the MBA level and at the undergraduate level, started in the early 1990s. So it's been around for a long time. I think one of the big things that's kind of different about how we do programming from a lot of the other top schools is that we're really focused on the broad spectrum of entrepreneurship. There's a lot of programs that are really just looking at kind of tech entrepreneurship. And, I mean, tech is an important part of the economy. But UCLA has had a lot of great entrepreneurs who have done food and beverage, who have done entertainment, who've done real estate. And the programming has been designed to support people who might be doing, any type of entrepreneurship, whether it's high tech or not.
Amazing. Yeah, that diversity is so important. It seems like there's so many different career paths you can go with this degree. My final question for you is there any resources, maybe website, books, articles, that you would recommend to someone like me, just beginning into the field and wanting just kind of an access path into the information?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's I mean, one of the things is there's lots of great resources these days that you can find on the web. There's certain things that I think are useful, also just as kind of background. So one that I think is really valuable and worth keeping an eye on is a company called Carta.com. So the Carta is a startup itself. Its initial business was keeping track of cap tables, which are basically the ownership of companies for other startups. That's actually fairly complicated. But then they've been branching out into a lot of other services. So for example, now they'll do benchmarking. So if you're looking at getting a job in a startup as, let's say that a marketing officer, you can look up and say, well, here's the job title I'm looking at. This is the stage that the company's at. And then get benchmarks from them for like what's the range of pay, which is incredibly useful. For understanding venture capital better, even Brad Feld has a couple of really good books that I think are they're good because they're sophisticated, but at the same time they're easy to get into because they provide lots of examples. So he sort of walks through the math on how investments work and how that affects the ownership in the company with clear kind of simple examples. I also there's a book that's a little bit more advanced, but one that I really like called Entrepreneurial Strategy. It's a new textbook that's coming out by Josh Gans, Scott Stern, and Aaron Scott. And one of the things that I like about it is a very disciplined look at how to think about different parts of the entrepreneurial process. It's a very sort of strategic orientation, thinking about, what's your product strategy, what's your HR strategy, what's your identity as a company? Do you have, what are your goals besides just selling? And I think those are all sort of good resources for starting.
Amazing. I'll have to check out all of those. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and it was a pleasure meeting you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.